good evening, and good morning. Welcome to our webinar, and thank you all for joining us from all around the world for this webinar organized by the Centers of International Business Education at Michigan State University and Texas A&M as part of our Research Spotlight series. With David, we've been doing these Research Spotlight series for quite some time, and we've always had great presenters and very interesting topics, and I'm glad that you joined us today. The topic of today's webinar is the need for survey research in international business and marketing. David Griffith and I will be your co-hosts today. I'm Ahmet. I'm an associate professor of international business and marketing at Michigan State University Broad College. And I also serve as the director of the International Business Center, MSU Cyber at MSU. David is the Hallie van der Heijden Chair in Business, Professor of Marketing, and Associate Director of Research at Texas A&M Cyber. We have three accomplished international business marketing scholars who have done extensive work using surveys. Our first panelist is Professor Cheryl Nakata. She holds the Joseph M. Bryan Distinguished Professor of Innovation at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Formerly, Cheryl was Professor of Marketing and International Business, as well as Department Head of Managerial Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research and teaching interests are innovation, culture, strategy, and the social and global impact of businesses. Our second panelist is from Koç University, Istanbul, Turkey. Professor Ayşegül Özsomer is Professor of Marketing, and she holds a PhD in Marketing from Michigan State University and an MBA from Boğaziçi University, Istanbul, Turkey. Over the last 20 years, Ayşegül's research primarily focused on strategic marketing, global marketing, brand management, and emerging market multinationals. Today, our third panelist is Matthew Robson from Cardiff University. Matt is Professor of Marketing and International Management and Associate Editor of the Journal of International Marketing. His research and teaching interests focus on, but are not limited to, the domains of international strategic relationship and retail marketing. Before we move on with our panelists with their presentations, I would like to remind you that you can write your questions to David and send us via the chat function. David will monitor the chat box closely and group them and pose the questions to the panelists at the end of their presentations. So enjoy. We're going to start with Cheryl Nakata.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you all see that? Okay, great. All right, thank you for the warm welcome and the wonderful opportunity to share some perspectives and thoughts about international marketing. So I'm going to look at the landscape of international marketing strategy and where we've been and where we may venture through survey research. So over the decades, there have been multiple reviews of the IM or international marketing literature. And these reviews have pointed out that strategy has been an enduring subject of study. According to one of these reviews, 27% of all papers are on strategy, really the highest proportion and surpassing the second leading topic of buyer behavior. These reviews have also highlighted that survey is a major method. While increasingly, surveys are performed as part of a mixed methodology, incorporating, for example, secondary data, survey research remains a primary approach in IM research. And all of this is to say that international marketing strategy and survey methods have been and will continue to be a leading arena of scholarly work. Based on these reviews and my own thinking about the IM literature, I'd like to pose and address two questions. The first is, where have we been? In other words, what topical landscape have we been traversing for our international marketing research inquiries? I see that topical landscape as consisting of four areas of study: the organization, the market, and the strategic decisions, and ultimately business performance. Now, on the left are the issues of the firm in terms of their environments, their internal qualities and structures, including subsidiaries. I have in blue, I'm sorry, the print is rather small, but I have in blue some commonly investigated topics like national culture, market orientation, which Ahmet may know a little bit about, and marketing coordination among subsidiaries. And on the right, sort of in a parallel form, we have the issues of the market, whether the market is the country, region, global, or a diaspora. And here the studies are focused on their environments, economic, legal, trade, and so forth, the market offerings and competitors, and of course, customers. And among topics receiving a lot of attention have been coup biases, liability of foreignness, and competitive advantage of products and services. Now, affecting or being affected by both of these green spheres, if you will, are strategic decisions. And these are decisions that firms make at macro, meso, and micro levels. And certain themes have received considerable and fairly consistent attention over time, such as entry mode, internationalization, and at the meso level, the standardization and adaptation issue, which, by the way, while well investigated, still deserves a lot more study. And then at the micro level, things like supply chain rationalization. And ultimately, of course, strategy research is very concerned about how all three of these feed into performance, with an emphasis on sales, shares, ROI, and so forth. Now, in many cases, researchers have focused on the left and the center of this landscape, looking at how conditions within and around firms influence these choices, whether those are direct, indirect, or conditional impacts. An example would be Luo et al.'s 2005 IMR paper on how top management teams' international experience, so that would be in this circle here, and the firm's innovative and marketing capabilities affect the speed of foreign market entry. Another example would be Zhou et al.'s 2007 GIBS paper looking at how Born Global's home-based social networks, again, aspect of the firm, play a mediating role between their inward and outward internationalization process and firm performance. In other cases, researchers have focused on the right and the center of this landscape. Song et al. Published a 2018 JAMS paper looking at ways a market's national culture impacts advertising design and launch timing. So this would be macro decisions, which in turn influence consumer product evaluations and ultimately firm performance. And of course, we can also have many examples of studies that look at all four of these areas. Now, while the foci that I've just described briefly have provided rich and fertile ground for international market survey research, I'd like to pose and address a second question. Where may we venture? In other words, what topics are deserving of future study? And I'd like to go back to my diagram. One area that I think we can go much deeper and further in is in the center, the red boxes, strategic decision-making. Why? Because strategic decisions really form the heart of strategy. In Rajan Varadarajan's thought piece in JAMS on marketing strategy, he defines marketing strategy as follows, that it is an organization's integrated pattern of decisions that specify its crucial choices about products, markets, and so forth that offer value to customers, enabling the organization to achieve its goals. So what we have sometimes are, a good many studies that look at, say, the left circles in relation to performance or the right circles in relation to performance. But here, the center is bypassed. So a question might be, well, if we're going to look more deeply at strategic decisions, how could we do that? And here, Varadarajan gives a wonderful suggestion in his own definition. He says, these are integrated patterns of decisions. What forms of integration could we look at? Well, going back here, one possibility is to look at the three levels of macro, meso, and micro decisions and how they affect one another. This might be a hierarchy of effects. It may be a recursive set of relationships. It may be interactive. We need to know more about this. And then, of course, their impact on performance. Another approach to integrated patterns of decisions would be to look at one of these levels more deeply, such as micro, where I have the marketing mix. A nice example of this is Bahadir et al.'s 2015 JIBS paper on marketing mix and brand sales in relation to country market characteristics. And here the authors looked at if and how all elements of the marketing mix in combination impact brand sales, and looking also at several endogenous and exogenous contingencies. A second path forward into the future is demonstrated by this diagram. So it's basically the same one you saw before, but I've added these yellow circles. So this second opportunity is really to expand our notion of environments and stakeholders from our traditional interpretations. The pandemic and now a freshly started war in Eastern Europe are showing us that there are worldwide environmental forces that have a direct bearing on international business and marketing. It'd be important to account for these at both the org and the market ends. And some of these issues we could study further are the roles of health, climate, and war on what we do in international marketing strategy and business. We should also recognize that organizations are operating in wider and more complex, or in relation to wider, more complex sets of stakeholders. So here it's on both sides. Not only are we really interested in customers, we're also interested in governments, NGOs, activists, and even marginalized stakeholder groups. So on the organization end, this is where the topics of sustainability, social responsibility, and environmentalism can have a role and should be studied. And then on the market side, co-creation and the marginalization of groups. Super important is the need to correspondingly expand our metrics of performance to include, for example, the triple bottom line and societal and employee well-being. Now, a third path forward is perhaps to look at the most pervasive and dynamic force reshaping international business and marketing today, which are information technologies, which continue to evolve very rapidly. So here on the org side, we could look at, for example, the Internet of Things, IoT. How does the Internet of Things cross national and regional boundaries in international marketing strategy and business strategy? And how do firms correspondingly observe the varying and conflicting regulatory frameworks governing the use of these technologies? Another question that we could look at: what are ethical considerations in applying these technologies to global strategies? Regulatory and ethical considerations are really coming together in dialogue and in consideration. On the market side, how might customer journeys and the use of tech-based omnichannels be designed internationally? And how may journey touch points differ cross-culturally? So I know I went through this very quickly. I wanted to give you some thoughts on where we've been in terms of topics that we have studied and what are possible pathways forward in areas that we need more study on. So that's it. Thank you very much.
We do have one question. So before we move to the next presenter,
sure.
It's directed at you, Cheryl.
All right.
Do strategic decision makers themselves, entrepreneurs, managers, are included and studied enough in research questions?
Okay, I would say no. We need much more research on these decision makers themselves, the managers. And we have certainly some studies that look at the demographics, or I mentioned the Lowe study looking at the international marketing experience of managers and how that impacts some of their decisions and strategies. But no, there's so much more that we could definitely study about those managers and entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Ayşegül?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David and Ahmet, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk about these topics always. And I think after Cheryl gave us the landscape, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to walk there. And special thanks to my wonderful PhD students, Müge Güzel and Selin Altaras, for their input. So the need to do survey research, I want to talk a little bit about advantages, disadvantages, potential challenges, and how to deal with them. So more like tips related to best practices, and also following on Cheryl's point of more collecting data from managers. So response rates, common method variance, social desirability, causal inference, and endogeneity, a little bit with the given the limited time. Now, when we look at some of the marketing journals, we see, especially in JM, quite a sharp decline in survey-based research, especially in the last years. And the same is happening in GEMS, and JMR already had rather low share of survey research. So what's happening? Why are we seeing this? Well, one reason is that survey research, I think, is not appreciated enough lately. Self-reported data, particularly from managers, are best gathered data on beliefs, attitudes, motivations, and traits that underline what we do. Our behavior is best collected with surveys. And surveys are very advantageous for testing firm-related phenomena that secondary data or observation does not reveal. And for exploratory purposes, surveys can help us. What are some strategic managerial problems, issues that we could study further? And also establishing generalizability, particularly external validity. At the firm level, usually it's not possible to randomly assign the strategy alternatives and then test differences like we do with random assignment in experiments. So we have to keep this in mind, that when we're talking about marketplace behavior, really survey method is one of the best alternatives. Unfortunately, I'm sure all of us here shared similar experiences. Experimental findings are generalized too far and favored too much by reviewers and editors lately. So how we need to know, we need to also understand when to use surveys, particularly for naturally occurring phenomena, suitable for understanding attitudes, intentions. It's very attractive for international marketers due to the lower cost and faster response and broader reach, particularly when we are using online surveys. And we can collect large samples, very effective with large samples. And the big strength, which experimental research lacks, is higher representativeness. Depending on the samples we collect, the representativeness tends to be higher. So the ecological validity tends to be higher as well. However, we do have some disadvantages. We are not able to test causal relationships, particularly with cross-sectional designs. We are not able to control heterogeneity, meaning in a single survey, we cannot measure all potential IVs, mediators, moderators, which may lead to omitted variable biases, which has implications for endogeneity, and can be prone to other biases, social desirability, non-response, etc. and also highly scrutinized lately by reviewers and editors. So these are some of the areas in marketing, particularly where we see a lot of survey-based research. What I would like to do is a little bit address how we can fix some of these problems or challenges. For example, one issue would be response rates. Sometimes, response rates may be too low, but also too high. Sometimes reviewers do not believe how high a response rate can be. In fact, I faced such a problem many years ago. So how do we handle this? So one thing, particularly when we're collecting data from managers, what can we do? How can we encourage entrepreneurs, top level, middle level managers to participate in our surveys? Well, first of all, if the topic is relevant, timely, and interesting, managers are really willing to allocate their time. Then it helps a lot to personalize the communication, meaning their names, their positions, special letters written to them personally, ensuring confidentiality, ensuring that data collected will not be shared with data consolidators or providers helps a lot. Only the authors will see and analyze the data. Adding phrases like that helps a lot. Also, developing a win-win setup. What do I mean? Well, if they participate, conducting a workshop where results are shared and discussed. Also, promising and delivering an executive report where industry averages are provided. There's a lot of controversy here, but they say managers do not want a small token of appreciation. My own experience has shown that it really helps. It really helps even with top level managers. For example, we did some research in Japan with top managers, and we learned that in Japan, stamp collection is a big hobby and is valued a lot. So what we did was we got a stamp set of 4, and in fact, we even ran a little experiment there. 50% received stamps of Marilyn Monroe, and 50% received a US soccer team. And in fact, maybe you can guess who enticed the responding more. Now, mid-level managers, coupons, ballots, all these type of things, which make the participation a little bit more fun, I think helps. Also facilitating responding by linking within the email rather than an attachment helps. Or if you're sending a personalized letter, pre-stamped envelopes help. And in the past, response rates used to be much lower when collecting data from managers via online. Now that's changing a little bit. That is, we can also collect data from managers online as well. Now, a second issue of challenge is the common method variance, which is not dealt with effectively. And here, common method variance is a systematic measurement error. So we have to deal with that, especially if we're collecting data cross-sectionally. So I would like to emphasize, please pay attention a priori what you can do. For example, you can use multiple data sources, respondents, dividing the dependent variable and independent variable collections from separate respondents. Trying to obtain objective data in addition to subjective data, using varying scale formats, and avoiding using vague terms. And here, I think we do not pre-test our surveys enough. I cannot emphasize the importance of pre-tests, particularly making sure that managers, especially, maybe running a pre-test with 7, 8 managers sitting in front of them in person, and making sure that really they do understand the terms, the constructs that you are trying to measure. And there are also some post-hoc methods. I'm not going to get into those. But I found a nice example of a recent publication. Yin and co-authors published about international joint ventures. For example, what they did a priori, they collected data from two key informants. Manager one gave answered questions on IVs, such as partner dependence. And manager two answered questions on strategies and outcomes, such as exploration, exploitation, new product performance, and IJV performance. Also, when we designed the surveys, psychological and format separation of the IVs and DVs help. For example, something I do is I include them in different sections and also provide separate instructions at the beginning of each section. And to reduce apprehension, again, assuring confidentiality and that there are no right or wrong answers. So even managers actually worry a lot about giving wrong answers if they are giving the wrong information. So assuring that there is no right or wrong answer also helps. And the same paper competently used some post hoc methods as well, such as Lindell and Whitney's method of partial correlation and adjusting the correlations and estimating the coefficients again. So I think with common method variance, we're in big territory and good territory now. Hans Baumgartner's recent paper looks at papers published in JIM, and out of 93 papers, 78 actually are on survey research. And out of those, 48 discuss common method variance. And out of these, specific post hoc analysis are done in 44. And interestingly for me was that 23 of them actually apply multiple methods. So with regard to common method variance, I think we have made quite a lot of progress, and the standard has gone up. The best practices have really caught on. And here are some other examples of recent papers using it. Now, briefly, I want to talk a little bit about social desirability bias, which can be a reason for common method variance, especially a problem in in-person interviews. And again, we can actually control them directly. There are ways of partialing the effects out. And also response style bias, which in my experience, I have seen it a lot as a source of additional variance. What do I mean by this? For example, in some cultures, there is midpoint responding, such that, for example, in Turkey, we see a lot of avoiding the ends of the scales and going on a 1 to 5 point scale, for example, not saying 5 or 1, but going in the middle. And in fact, a recent project we did for a large automotive company, they were even using these salesperson service evaluation. They were using the same scales in the US and Turkey. And the salespeople in Turkey, they were saying they never get 5s. And I said, I'm not surprised. They don't get 5s because Turkish people actually say 5, the maximum belongs to God. So you don't give that to anyone. So the very significant implications for salesperson bonuses, pay, motivation. So it's not only in our research, but in practice, this type of response style differences has important implications. In another recent research in Mexico, again, for example, they showed a bias toward extreme responses, and in Korea, more like similar to Turkey, midpoint responses. In Japan, there's also social desirability, what we would call acquiescence bias, trying to give you, the researcher, what they think to be nice, what they would like to hear. So what's the solution? Add a scale usage variable to your survey. What is a scale usage variable? That will capture response style effects and biases. For example, adding a few questions which have nothing to do with your substantive constructs, like a college education is very important for success in today's world. I like to visit places that are totally different from my home. So especially if we are researching other issues. This scale usage variable shares no common content and is unrelated to the substantive variables of interest. Well, other, of course, weaknesses of our survey research is the fact that we cannot do causal inference. So lack of temporal separation. Solution, if we can do it, longitudinal data, where we can test cross-lagged effects. It's costly, time and money can introduce new sets of biases such as attrition or non-respondence. So the solution here always is to start with a strong and convincing conceptual foundation with underlying mechanisms, boundary conditions, and moderators. And of course, there is the endogeneity problem. I won't get too much into that, but just looking at recent papers published in marketing journals, we see a sharp increase in papers addressing endogeneity. So I think this is going to become the common standard, and we, as international business and marketing researchers, we need to become better in handling endogeneity. So to conclude, know when to use surveys. Experiments cannot provide evidence to naturally occurring phenomena. So make sure that we capture the phenomena whenever we need to capture a phenomena in its natural setting. For high ecological validity, surveys are the best approach. Improve survey designs. For example, if you have two different sets of questions, you can randomize it to your respondents. Also, quasi-experiments, especially in strategy research, field experiments, if there is a naturally occurring intervention, before-after type of studies can be done. And beware of reviewers who are very critical of surveys. Very recently, we had a small piece on COVID and can advertising brand fit improve consumers' healthy COVID behavioral intentions. And one reviewer comment, I put it here. So the reviewer said, I was expecting to read about a between subjects design for study 1 and then for study 2, a factorial design, but this is not what was presented. And we had to explain, how we were using real ads aired during the pandemic, etc. So basically, you have to be well versed as to when to use and when not to use surveys. And finally, like we are seeing in some recent papers published in JIBS, JIM, and IGRM, complement your surveys with other methods when possible, exploiting multi-method advantages. And then, of course, hope that the evil eye will do the job and protect your research from evil. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. We are getting some questions within the chat feature. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat feature. Questions that are to the current questions that are in the chat are for all of our panelists. So I will pose those to the panelists after Matt has had a chance to speak about his thoughts on the matter. Matt, take it away.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, thanks so much for inviting me to do this. It's a great honor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover some similar ground, I think, to the previous two panelists, but I'm going to deviate slightly and I'm going to focus on some thoughts that I have on the survey methodology based on the editing that I've been doing. So lots of the survey papers that have been through JIM would come from me, would come through me. So for instance, the Kevin Ju International Strategic Alliance paper is one that I handled. And I could see some things in the way that they used the survey methodology that really protected them from reviewers. So surveys, well, you know, as academics, of course, we want to focus on the science and methodologies that constitute the best and the highest possible science. But on the other hand, surveys have a lot of practical and policy relevance. If you speak to managers, if you speak to policymakers, they understand what a survey is and they understand the value of a survey. So I'm a little bit biased because it's my main methodology and I've spent 20 years using it. But, you know, if you think about it, you look in the business press. So how can I like a survey even more? Well, the police are using a survey and they're comparing Boris against other, you know, criminals in inverted comments. It's something that people get. Survey methodology is widely understood and it's widely used. And I think partly because of generalizability reasons. I think the sort of practitioners that I speak to, they understand that a survey can deliver that generalizability. Surveys are flexible, can be a main method. And I think the higher up the journal you go, maybe it's less likely that the survey is a main method and it might be a supplementary method. So I think Timo made a point in the chat about use of survey in JIBs. I would suspect that there's a higher percentage of a survey or higher chance of a survey being used as a main methodology in JIM as opposed to something like JIBs. So perhaps the higher the journal, the more you have kind of a mixed methods approach where a survey is in there to do a particular job, but it's complemented by some other approaches, most likely some kind of secondary data. Surveys drill down into what constructs actually are versus proxies that can't offer similar precision. And sometimes I see editorials where there's almost like a lament from the editor about certain constructs being very difficult to capture using secondary data and using proxies. So for instance, going back to my context of strategic alliances, there's a big literature stream on learning, but learning is a process and it's very difficult to capture using a proxy because managers have various steps in that process. And really you can drill down into those steps using a survey. So just heading down here before I head back, this is a paper that some colleagues and I published a couple of years ago, and it won the Kavuskill Award in Journal of International Marketing. I think Shaheen and Nat might actually be participants here. But what we did in this is we identified a construct. So exporters, so export managers, they're operating all over the world. They're often in foreign markets, speaking to customers, speaking to distributors, etc. They're gathering all of that intelligence into those markets. But then what do they do with it? How do they channel that intelligence into some kind of repository in the exporting firm? So another export manager going to a different market can actually tap into that intelligence. And there are various ways of doing this, but one approach is to have some kind of repository. And to have this repository for this intelligence, the manager, the export managers, would have to go through some kind of process. So they have to articulate the knowledge, they have to codify the knowledge, they have to share the knowledge, and the company has to internalize the knowledge properly. So a set of procedures. Now, you can't tap this, you can't measure this really with anything else apart from a survey. So we did a lot of pre-study work and we identified what these processes were. And you'll see on the right-hand side, I'm sorry about the small font, but you've got specific items that really pack in the detail. So if a company in the data set, a UK company or a Chinese company in this particular study, if they answer high on these questions, then we know that they have those processes in place. And you don't get this through approaching this topic using secondary data. In fact, there was a conversation. You'll see there are 4 authors on the left-hand side there. There was a conversation to add another author that could actually approach this problem using secondary data. And they said to us, well, yeah, I've got this data set that actually captures that. Yeah, those 4 processes, I can capture them with secondary data. And then we had a look at what they had, and it was nothing like this. And I think this is one of those topics where really you do need a survey. So I think there are particular topics out there that the other panelists have hit on where survey research can really work. So you can drill down into actual constructs. I think surveys also benefit from pretty well-established techniques for cross-cultural comparison. One of those techniques I think was flagged on that slide that I just showed you, where we contrasted across UK and Chinese companies. So here's a little overlap. You can see we're mining the same sources, Ayşegül and me. So on the right-hand side, we've got the Baumgartner and Whiter's GIM paper from 2021 on common method variance. So what I think this shows is, well, actually N equals 71 in the years 2015 to 2019. That's a decent number of survey studies, right? So that's still a relatively high number that maybe backs up what I said earlier about survey methodology being maybe used more in GIM than it is in GIBS. I think a critical factor is, so N equals 30, you can see no common method variance is discussed in 30 of these papers, which I think is very interesting, because common method variance is a type of bias that is almost synonymous with survey work and kind of key informant surveys. And I think maybe some colleagues are not seeing the bigger picture. So what we do as academics is we try to plot what we think the reviewers will talk about. And of course, endogeneity has for a few years been the new thing to hit authors over the head with. So therefore, we're going to have a big section on endogeneity, and we're going to do all of those different tests. But hang on, what about common method variance? It's not gone away. So I think, you know, survey researchers have to focus on the pros and cons of their own methodology, which now a limitation, of course, is common method variance. Even if you've addressed it well, you should still talk about it. So on the left-hand side is the Donthu et al. Paper, also in GIM, from 2021. This is the bibliometrics paper that said that David is only the 2nd most cited scholar in international marketing. Now, I believe in the audience we might have number 1, but you know, I don't want to kind of open a can of worms there. So you'll see the bottom left-hand corner, research design, quantitative methods is high. So 91% of studies in GIM use quants. A small proportion, 3%, use qualitative, which is a ridiculously low number, isn't it? A ridiculously low proportion. So mixed methods, combining these two. So, okay, mixed methodology is on the way up, which we know, but this would tell me that mixed methodology is survey plus secondary data, survey plus experiment. It's not survey plus qualitative study. Yet, if you think about what a survey is doing, a survey helps us to drill down and to really understand constructs. It's so useful to do some kind of pre-study qualitative work, or to actually have some kind of post hoc qualitative work. And I think that's an opportunity for scholars. So I want to run through some tips now in survey design. So I'm going to cover tips at 3 levels. So firstly, survey design. Be as thorough as possible with population and sampling frame. So keep really detailed records. If you're working with a doc student that is doing the legwork here, they need to be keeping detailed records, because I do believe that at the start of your methodology section, where you're explaining the survey methods, you have to make sure that the reviewer at no point is seeing the red flag of transparency. I believe that one of the most common comments that you get back is, these procedures are not transparent. Sometimes reviewers will say that blatantly to the authors. Other times they will say it in the confidential comments to the editor. These guys are not transparent, which is putting a red flag in the editor's minds. So, I'm a big believer in the primacy effect. So if you think about what a reviewer is doing, they read the paper. What I sometimes do is you read the methodology, you read the literature review, you read some of the conceptual development. I give myself a break from the conceptual development by jumping forward into the methods, reading a bit of the methods, jumping back into the conceptual development, because I want to be kind of comparing the different sections. That's what I do as a reviewer. And if I'm seeing problems already in the front end, when I get to the method, I want that method section not to compound those problems. So what happens at the start of the method section, I think, is hugely important. So you have to make sure that you're as transparent as possible, and you dot all the I's and you cross all the T's. And I think the temptation is to take shortcuts, to get to that endogeneity section, which your reviewers are going to be talking about. But don't cut corners in terms of explaining your population, explaining response rate, explaining your sampling frame, how you kind of purify the sample, all those crucial things. So use multiple procedures to ensure informant competency. I think ex post competency questions that you see in surveys, I think they're useful. But when you have those 3 questions at the back end of your survey and your manager or your informant is filling that out, what they're thinking about is their response across the whole of the survey. But what if you want to be using specific parts of the survey where their competency and their knowledge dips? And I've seen this in the past so when you're surveying international marketing managers, but you want to ask them about something like sustainability of their company. So sustainability is not necessarily something that the export manager knows about. So the export manager at the end may say, yeah, I was very knowledgeable about those questions, but then you kind of look at the correlation matrix afterwards between all of the constructs, and you look at the means and the standard deviations, and you think there might be a problem in that part of the questionnaire. So what you have to do is to make sure you're using other techniques to ensure the competence of your informants. E.g., you speak to them beforehand if you can do that, if you've got that level of control. Keep respondents on the hook by supplying them with insights. I think Ayşegül talked about this, but you need to be ready to go. If you want those informants to come back to give you more data because the reviewers ask for more data, you've got to have kept them on the hook. So you have to make sure that you've got some easily digestible analysis involving their company, maybe involving means that you can give to them very quick, maybe with some visualizations in there, something that they can take to a team meeting, and that keeps you on the hook in case you need extra data. Plan your responses to common method bias. Don't be one of the 30 papers that didn't talk about it in those GIM publications. And I think, of course, there are different approaches that you can use here. I don't necessarily have a preference for these different approaches. So, for instance, the Kevin Zhu paper in GIM on international strategic alliances, they use the 2 informant approach. Very soon in their methodology section, they're talking about their 2 informants. And that is like a green flag to any kind of reader that is worried about key informant bias. So this is, on the left-hand side, we have a subsection from Abadia and Robson, 2021. I won't take any credit for this. This is Claude's methodology section. And this is all about the primacy effect, right? So it's very detailed, very intricate, lots of kind of checks and balances. When you get down into the data part, we use 3 secondary data sets and collected 4 primary data sets. And boy, the next bit of the paragraph is complex because it has to explain that. But the reader is thinking, wow, okay, so there's some subjective data here, 2 time points, but there's a bunch of secondary data as well. So even if they have a negative predisposition towards surveys, they may be thinking that this is okay. I think one interesting aside is you see second line of the method, French exporters. So when this initially went to the journal, France wasn't disclosed. And I think that's the right decision, because the minute you say France, you kind of give away your identity, or at least Claude would have given away his identity. But then, it's one of those kind of minor things where a reader might think, why aren't they disclosing? Is that a transparency thing? So you've got to really go through the language and make sure that you're dealing with all the fine-grained decisions about transparency, so that you don't give that red flag. Okay. So in terms of tips for the questionnaire, okay, I'm going to run pretty quick now because I think I've taken too much time. So for the questionnaire itself, make sure you're working with somebody who's really good with Qualtrics or however else you're delivering your online questionnaire. Because I think there's so much that you can do now in that interface that can give you just such a good outcome in terms of the quality of the data that you get through the survey. If you don't have someone that is an expert, it's worth developing the expertise yourself. Guard against absolute length of the questionnaire. So 100 questions, I think I've heard once. I believe I was in a presentation, Aviv Shoham was there. I think Aviv might be in the audience. I was trying to remember how many questions did Aviv say? But I think, how many questions you can get away with in a survey before the reader starts tailing off in the quality of their responses. Okay, it depends on who your respondents are as well as how excited they are by your research topic. But I think this is a critical issue. Don't give away your constructs, reverse order them in the questionnaire, etc. Make sure that your informants can't just run through straight line answering, and you can do that with attention check questions, some reverse worded questions, but not so many, because they tend to deplete Cronbach alpha and some of the validity and reliability stuff. Some marker variable questions like Ayşegül showed, just to give them a bit of a pause from your substantive content. In terms of measures, I think gone are the days of including many construct measures. Many items for each construct. So as Cheryl mentioned, if you want to have some kind of holistic approach in your survey, and the reviewer might be expecting you to cover off anything else that is relevant to the particular theory that you're using for your core constructs, then you've got to make sure that you have coverage across all of the different elements of the theory, which means that you can't do what I used to do in the past, which is have many items for each of your constructs, because you've got to make sure that you deal with admitted variables. You've got to have some instruments in potentially that can help you to deal with endogeneity, etc. So use really good language in your prompts and your measures. So not just the measures themselves, but also the prompting sentences, which you should disclose in your paper. So one reviewer recently said to the author that I saw, I struggle to understand how a manager can give a reliable answer to the questions of this scale. So at this point, the reviewer is figuring, okay, I'm going to reject this paper. So I think when a reviewer wants to reject a paper, they hammer you for your measures. And so they try to hammer the author because there was too much fancy language, too much jargon, too much terminology in the measures. And you look at them and you think, how did they ever have face validity? How did they pass any kind of manager's desk in the pre-study stage, in the interview stage? So fair enough. Use in-depth interviews to modify your language. I think I've kind of picked on this point. You can be bold. You can mix scales together, I believe. Don't just have to use all of the items from the one scale, but you have to keep detailed records again, because reviewers like to pick up on this stuff. So when they're going for your measures, I remember I published a paper in Journal of World Business and the reviewers were really going for my measures. We'd combined scales, but we had a really good storyline. So based on the definition of the variable, we had measures that very finely fit that definition. Didn't matter that the measures came from a different scale because they fit our definition. And I think it's good practice to start with your definition rather than, okay, I've got these measures. I need to make sure the conceptual thing fits it. Let's find a definition, you should have the definition already. That should have been a key part of the process. Okay, so that's it. There are my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt. Excellent. We have quite a few comments in the chat, so I'm going to pose some of these, kind of going through them and sort of bunching them together. And there's been a lot that have been sent to me as well. So, Matt, you did a great job sort of talking about a lot of the green flags that you want to give to reviewers. You know, the rigor that you're developing the survey with. A question in the chat is sort of, you know, the same issue is, a lot of reviewers are negatively disposed to survey research. So we'd like to hear Cheryl and Ayşegül's thoughts on sort of how you can position that both going into the submission process, but also how do you deal with the reviewers who just are like, you know, surveys is not a rigorous method, you know, this is a problem. Cheryl, why don't we start with you and then we'll go to Ayşegül.
I think some of the suggestions have already been made about, elaborating the rigor of the research, the survey method being conducted. But in addition to that, I think where some reviewers may be a little lighter on that criticism of, you know, this is an obsolete method, would be if the question, the research question itself is really compelling, really timely, that the impact and the implications of the question to be answered are almost apparent within the first paragraph of the paper. So honing in on not sort of the same old question being done in a slightly different way or slightly different scale is really, I think, one pathway. Find a profound question to answer, and that, as others have pointed out, are uniquely answered within the real world context, if you will, of survey method.
Excellent. Ayşegül?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to convince reviewers by matching your topic to your sample. So if your research questions can be answered by, you know, the key informants, the managers, if you're trying to understand their decision-making, how they perceive risk, how they respond to risk, how they respond to uncertainty, there is no other option but to actually ask them so that you get into their minds. And I think at the beginning, having maybe a paragraph about how you really, this is a managerial problem, and you know, you need to understand what managers are doing if your sample, if your research is fit to managers. And if it's consumers, I think again, as I mentioned in my slides, bringing it home that this is a naturally occurring phenomena and you cannot manipulate it. If you manipulate it, you're going to lose the naturalness, and the manipulation will make it non-realistic, which is actually a criticism with many experiments, which the manipulations tend to be so unrealistic. So maybe explaining that, I think if that part is nicely written, usually reviewers, you know, after all, reviewers are very experienced people who they may not use surveys, but they know it. And they may actually appreciate it, that, you know, this topic is done, whether with consumers or managers, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand a naturally occurring phenomena in a natural setting. I think one other way is, if possible, in fact, Peter and Stan have a recent paper, 2022 actually, just accepted, you know, culture across, what was the topic maybe? So they started with a survey, then they went to an experiment, to a second survey, but then trying to understand the mechanisms behind is when maybe an experiment can be used. So multi-methods, especially with consumer data, I think is the way to go. Because we have our limitation with surveys, we have correlational studies, but we don't have causation. And I think currently, given how scarce publication pages are, our contribution has to be more. And one way to do that is to complement a survey with maybe either qualitative. I mean, Matt, I think you said such an important thing that we're really not utilizing qualitative research sufficiently. We can learn so much by building a study which starts with qualitative and then maybe continues with quantitative. So maybe after a survey, JM had a call saying, you know, how can we make sense of what we found with a survey, maybe going back to managers, making them explain it. So those would be my suggestions.
Excellent, thank you. Anything else you would like to add on that, Matt?
I think those answers are very clear. I think you've got to use the mixed methods. And so if you're kind of leading with a survey, it's useful to explain exactly why you're doing that. So if it's a particular phenomenon that can't easily be approached with an experiment or with secondary data, you can make that point rather than just jumping into the survey. And then when you do move into a second methodology, explain clearly why you're doing that. So what you couldn't do with the survey and what you can do with the new methodology. So I think, you know, Peter Magnussen's papers where they use multiple methodologies are very clear in why they're moving across those different methodologies.
Excellent, excellent. So the next question deals with the sort of the approach we're doing to surveys. So surveys were generally, you know, we're concerned a lot about sampling approach so that we could generalize to the population. As response rates dwindled, many people started moving towards market research companies for panel respondents. In this case, it's either impossible or very difficult to calculate a response rate because you're usually not going to get you have to pay a lot more to get the market research company to do a slow rollout. And so what are your thoughts on the use of panel companies as a vehicle for, you know, addressing respondents? Cheryl, would you like to start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the aspect of the response rate, while it's important, I think if you have, again, showcase and plan ahead for other details of the methodology to shine, I think there's a way to make the panel or the professional survey research company results be very relevant. In many cases, I think the market research company can access a particular group of people that would be difficult to do through other methods. So for example, I did a survey study recently on design thinking. And you know, that's a very particular innovation method. And the company was able to find me a cohort of people who could actually answer questions about that. So if, again, this is married back to the notion of the topic itself being intriguing, interesting, and important, and not terribly accessible through other methods, you may be able to overcome some of the classic objections to survey research, and in this particular case, the use of professional market research companies.
Ayşegül?
Yes, I think that's an important question. And these market research companies can help us in many ways, like Cheryl mentioned, because we can specify the specs of the sample. You know, we want a certain age group, so they can filter from their sample and get us really a well-defined sample, which really fits our research question. However, a recent experience, we used a panel, and we have to ask an attention check question, because with a recent panel, and quite a good panel actually, about 38% failed our attention question, which was kind of a big wake up for me. I didn't expect that high. So, you know, finding ways of guessing and goofing and definitely not keeping the survey long. I think 6-7 minutes max with lots of pretests so that, because I think the attention span, especially with consumer respondents, is very, very short. And I found attention check questions and very short surveys to work with lots of pre-test.
Matt?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I've used some panel studies before. I would endorse what the other panelists have said. I think you've got to be very kind of careful in doing everything you can to control the quality. So the negotiation with the panel company to really precisely identify the informant and the characteristics of the informant that you need. So the sort of research I do is managerial. So it's a particular type of manager, they would have particular managerial roles, particular experience, and you would negotiate with them. Of course, what happens is the price is just going up. And if you want the response rate information, of course, the price is going up. And so I think, you know, a logical thing to do is to make sure you're cooperating with other people so that between you, you've got the budget in order to pay for good quality data. So in one recent case, I think I've got 3 co-authors. We're negotiating. There's a ton of emails with the panel company, and we're getting to where we want to be in terms of very precisely identified informants, and we're likely to get the response rate information. The design of the survey, we've got filter questions, but they don't like so many filter questions. The last thing they want is to annoy their panelists, because on page 6 of the questionnaire, you know, you've got a filter question that they don't respond to because they're just straight lining at that point. So, you know, you have to negotiate how many filter questions you're going to have and where they're going to appear, because it's the sort of thing that the company doesn't necessarily want to be in there, because it could just spoil a response. Pay extra for the soft launch as well, because then you can see if your questionnaire is working. You can see how much time they're spending in the different sections. And sometimes I've been involved in research where we tell the company, look, if they respond, if they go through all of the questions, and if they do it in the, you know, if they do it in less than 5 minutes, then no, we're not paying for that. We're not going to have it. But again, you know, the price can go up, and you find you're dealing with a second person, like a line manager, because you push in the first one a bit too hard. But, you know, I think it helps to have a team, because then you've got more budget, so you can pay for better quality data.
Okay. Excellent. Now, this is kind of a longer question that people are asking. So some would say that over time, the purpose of survey research has changed, where the informant, the key informant, was reporting on what the company was doing, which is now captured somewhat by secondary data. So the question then becomes, what is the role of survey research today, and what questions, and I think Cheryl got a little bit into this in terms of the risk perceptions that managers are looking at, you know, what types of questions are most appropriate for survey research and survey research alone? I hope that made sense. If no one takes that, that did not make sense.
Kind of, you know, attitudinal things. I think one of the panelists had, you know, information on there about types of constructs. Was it Ayşegül? So there are certain types of constructs, more psychological constructs, that may kind of fit survey research.
Okay, Ayşegül?
Okay.
Maybe maybe I can share again.
Okay.
Okay, going back from my. So, well, I think I didn't have too much detail there, but basically, you know, anytime we need to get into, I think managerial decision making, for example, would be a nice area to start, trying to understand, you know, what they are going through, some of the constructs, how they are correlated, which actually, once we understand those, for example, you know, in a crisis case, let's say the COVID crisis, you know, how would they respond? What would be some alternatives they would consider? Why would they choose one but not the other? You know, these type of things, whenever there is high uncertainty and we're trying to understand the decision-making of the managers, tap into their mental models, I think those are particularly useful, both in management research and also in marketing for survey research. And then, you know, once we have some correlational evidence, then we can try to understand the mechanism behind it, which actually would, you know, lead us to experimental designs.
Excellent. And for all the participants, I would recommend checking the chat. We actually have a number of very interesting conversations going on amongst really important scholars in our field. Matt, your 100-question thing stimulated a lot of discussion over whether that's too many or whether that's too few.
I went too big. I think I went too big, David.
But also, I think Diamantis makes a really important point that he's had both wonderful experiences with panel companies and also terrible experiences with panel companies. So his advice is tread carefully, which I think is really, really important. I'd like to get a couple more questions in.
David, may I also respond to your other question before you move on, which is, it's a huge question. Maybe it's the core question of today's webinar. It's sort of like, how do we keep survey research alive, and where is it most useful? I think sometimes we forget that, especially with regard to international marketing, international business, that context is a huge part of the picture. And this is where I think survey research does shine, because it's able to capture context right now. And obviously you can do it in a longitudinal or historic fashion as well. That is difficult, I think, to capture in other methods. Certainly, you know, experimental design is pretty far removed from that. So whether you're talking about the context of, say, a war or a pandemic or a new trading bloc or a shift in economic arrangements between two countries, those are much more capturable, I think, through survey. Again, obviously through filtered by the informant's perception of what's going on, but it's difficult to find proxies for these sorts of contextual matters in secondary data without it being pretty, sometimes at such a high aggregate level that it doesn't really reflect well the contextual matter. The other thing that I think, or area that I think survey research really has a forte is in processual or a process-based dynamics that are also difficult to capture in these more static methods. So we can design questions and constructs that get at process matters, whether it's in the form of mental models that was just mentioned or other forms, but the survey research is primed to do that really well. So I just wanted to throw those thoughts out as well.
Excellent comments, Cheryl. Excellent comments. The next one is kind of a balancing act, I think. So respondents at time complain that the items of constructs appear similar. And then Matt, you made the comment of, we can't collect so many constructs. So sort of how this evolves into the question is, in the research process, the review process, you would be using a cut down scale of a pre-existing measure. And therefore, how do you justify to the reviewers that the construct that you're capturing is actually the construct that someone else captured, because you're not using the full measure? And I think we've all run into that. All survey researchers have run into that issue. Is there any of our panelists who would like to take that? Or do you just want to pass? Matt, please.
Yeah, I can take it. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think if it's reflective, then all of those items should reflect the definition. but you do see sometimes in the wording of definitions, it flags particular terms, and you see if you don't use items 5 and 6 from the scale, maybe that word has to come out of the definition. I think it's just best to be really transparent. So if you've only used 3 or 4 measures in your questionnaire, to be clear on that. What reviewers sometimes suspect is, of course, that you might have trimmed half of your questionnaire out in order to get your moderation to work. But I think maybe they would suspect that in the past, but I think nowadays, with things like endogeneity, omitted variable bias, the fact that you need, maybe a shorter, punchier questionnaire, you just don't have the luxury to ask so many identical questions.
Excellent. Ayşegül?
Yeah, thank you. That's such an important question, and probably one way to approach that, again, I'm talking about sending surveys to managers. So you want to include sufficient constructs, but you don't want to keep them too long. J.B. Steenkamp has a very nice paper on how to use short form scales for managerial research. I mean, one thing we see when we look at the measurement models of these kind of constructs is usually the first 3 items capture a lot of the domain of the construct sufficiently, maybe not ideally the best way, but sufficiently, particularly if these are going to be my moderators. If these are not my main focal constructs of interest, such as the DVs or the IVs, I think with moderators, using short form, maybe 3 item scales should be sufficient in the interest of survey length. With IVs and DVs, I would be a little bit more conservative because that's actually the substance of the paper. But with moderators, I would be fine with going down to, the research item response theory suggests that, if you have 3 very good items, you're capturing most of this construct domain. So I would do that.
Cheryl, would you like to comment?
The other thing I would add is that, there's the argument of having too many items that then inflate the reliability, the Cronbach alpha as well. And, so reviewers know that trick. You don't need to have 12 items for this rather simple construct. And so I think if you can show that your measurement model holds fairly well with fewer items, I think you've got an argument on the other side that you're not inflating reliability, for example. So
excellent. And this will be the last question. I'm sorry we can't get all the questions in, but our panelists, Avi, will take emails if you have any questions for them directly. So this is the last one. And I think every one of us who does survey research feels this pain. It seems like our expectations are increasing and increasing and increasing. And everyone's are. So, we don't want to play poor me, but a bit of a nagging issue. This question says, mixed methods require so much competencies, especially for researchers to be like PhD students or assistant professors. Any recommendations on how to sort of excel at bringing all these different methods together? And I think Matt touched a little bit on that by kind of suggesting to bring the research team together, which has different skill sets. But any comments, any parting comments you'd like to have on how everyone can do top quality research?
I think put together a good research team, which complements each other in terms of research skills, and enjoy the journey and enjoy the challenge.
Yeah. And maybe to add to that, hopefully over time, with working with a more collaborative, multi-method set of researchers, that people will acquire some of the knowledge to do more than one method, and over time be able to do some of these papers on their own or with just one other co-author. So.
Matt,
the only thing I would add is I think if you're combining methods, it's going to put a burden on you in terms of writing the thing up. So how much space, if you've got a qualitative section, how much space do you devote to it? If you've got like, meaty quotes, where do you put the quotes? Do they go in the web appendix? How much do you need to say in order to set up the theory for the subsequent quantitative part, the survey part? So I think it places an extra burden on the writing skills, which is probably why more heads are better than one, and you need that research team.
Excellent. Given that we had that discussion about number of items, I do want to, one of the points that was made in the comments by Diamantis is he notes, I'd be worried with just 3 items because measurement model is not independently identified. It has 0 degrees of freedom. With 4+ items, you don't have this problem and can run a CFA and test the scale. So I just wanted to make sure we brought that into the discussion. I think the number of questions we asked, the length of surveys, the number of items are all issues we need to be thinking about. And since Diamantis is here, formative versus reflective measures obviously becomes a big issue in making sure we're sort of top of the mark in terms of contribution. What I'd like to say as we start wrapping this up is thank you all speakers, Matt, Cheryl, Ayşegül, for just absolutely outstanding insights into the challenges and opportunities, and I like how Matt put it, green flag us through the process in many ways, the signals we need to send, the ideas we have to have in terms of the topic areas that Cheryl was talking about, or the methodological issues that Ayşegül was talking about. We had a great set of participants, attendees who've been very active in the chat. This is wonderful. We really appreciate that. I'd like to thank my team at Texas A&M University, Monica and Katie Lane, as well as the team at Michigan State University, Rhonda and Ahmet. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, everyone, and I'll turn it over to Ahmet for a few closing remarks. Unmute yourself.
Yep. Well, thank you. I just wanted to thank you for joining us, our panelists for joining us today. And certainly, we had a great audience today. This was a very interesting and informative session, not only because we had our panelists giving us very useful information, but also because of the interesting questions that our participants asked during the process and their contributions. And again, I'd like to thank our teams at Michigan State Cyber, MSU Cyber, and Texas A&M Cyber. Hopefully we're going to see you again in one of our meetings, in another research spotlight event. Thank you.
Thank you all. The recording of this will be available. You'll receive an email to all registered participants if you wish to review any of the material that's been brought here. Thank you once again. Everyone have a great day. Thank you, panelists. Have a good evening. Many of you it's getting quite late where you are. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
David and Ahmet.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.